Next up, it's Movie Spotlight, our weekly segment reviewing the latest releases at the Korean box office and online. And we do that with our panel of film critics who this week join us via video, virtually. First, we have Darcy Paquet with us. Darcy, hello. It's good to have you with us as always.
Hi, John.
And we also have Marc Raymond standing by as well. Hello, Marc. It's good to see you again.
Hello. Good to see you.
Okay, so a couple of interesting films to look at this week. One international, one local. Let's look at the international film first this week, which is called Belfast. It is a semi-autobiographical film by actor and director Kenneth Branagh. And last Sunday, it won the Best Original Screenplay Oscar at the Academy Awards. It is currently playing in theatres here in Korea, as well as being available online. Marc, what can you tell us about this film?
Yeah, this is the latest from Kenneth Branagh. And Kenneth Branagh is kind of known early on for his kind of Shakespeare adaptations as a writer-director, and such as Henry V and Hamlet. But he's had a really varied career. He's made an MCU film, Thor, and he's also recently done these Agatha Christie adaptations as well. This one's more of a personal film. It's actually his first movie, kind of his first original screenplay as a feature. And it does tell this kind of, as you mentioned, a semi-autobiographical tale. The lead character being a 9-year-old boy growing up in Belfast in 1969. And amidst this kind of sectarian violence that's happening in his formerly kind of peaceful neighborhood, this working class neighborhood. And he lives with both his parents and his grandparents. The grandparents played by Ciarán Hinds and Judi Dench, both who were nominated for supporting actors this year. And also, his father is working abroad in England, so his father isn't always around. And basically, the plot revolves around if they are going to stay in Belfast or if they are going to move to England to get away from both the job insecurity his father has, but also the greater political instability that's happening in the country.
So, Darcy, this type of film in which a director looks back at his childhood is quite familiar, actually. It's not a unique format. How do you think this entry compares to some of the other films that we might think about in this type of format?
Yeah, I mean, one of the films that really leaps to mind is Roma by Alfonso Cuarón, and which, I mean, maybe a bit of an unfortunate comparison for Belfast because Roma was such an incredible film. But but as you mentioned, I mean, there is kind of a whole subgenre of this, and I mean, going back years and years, I remember watching like Hope and Glory, which is another film that kind of reminded me a little bit of this. It's a British set film, kind of memories of growing up in the aftermath of World War II. Certainly, I think that when a director shoots a film like this, where the memories are so strong and that they have such an emotional connection to all the details in the story, often that results in a film that's very moving and that works for a wide audience. And this film, I think it was kind of quiet when it came out. A lot of people didn't have huge expectations for this movie, and then it unexpectedly really generated a lot of Oscar buzz, and it's traveled much more widely than people expected.
Right. Initially, as you said, it was quite a quiet film that there wasn't a lot of buzz about. But then this Oscar buzz did come about, and it was eventually nominated for 7 Oscars, including Best Picture. In the end, it just won a Best Original Screenplay. Marc, what did you make of the film? Was it worthy in the end of all the nominations that it got, do you think?
Not in my opinion. Actually, I thought it was one of the weaker of the 10 Best Picture Oscar nominations this year. And I think what I found interesting about the film and kind of disappointing is it didn't really feel that personal. I kind of wish it had had more of the feeling that you were getting something that was actually coming from a very personal place, and this it felt more kind of stereotypical and very similar to a lot of other films in this kind of subgenre or this type of movie. And I just didn't really end up having much of a connection to the film as a
Mm.
result. And even though I can see why it appealed to some people, because does have very good performances, and it's certainly not a bad film. It's enjoyable to watch, but it really kind of lacked kind of specificity to me. And so for to give an example, like it uses a lot of Van Morrison music in the film, almost as like a stand-in, like Van Morrison equals Belfast, which felt very kind of lazy to me. Like I kind of wanted something more kind of rich and kind of detailed. I thought you think about, for example, another movie from a couple of years ago, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood by Quentin Tarantino, also set in 1969. The soundtrack of that film was so much more evocative for me than this one. This one felt very just overall, the movie felt very flat visually as well. Like the black and white cinematography didn't really feel very evocative, not especially if you compare it to something like Roma, the
Mm.
Cuarón film that Darcy mentioned, which is a much richer use of black and white. This one just felt very, yeah, very standard to me. So I was kind of disappointed. Yeah.
I see. Darcy, what about you? I think I've got some hints that perhaps it wasn't as good as Roma, something you talked about earlier.
Well, a few movies are. I think that, I mean, part of it is a question of expectations as well, because I think knowing that, this is one of the films that's been nominated as the best picture of the year makes you go into it with somewhat higher expectations and makes you compare it to all these other movies that have come out. And and I agree with Mark in some ways as well. I mean, I saw this film in the theater a few days ago, and actually the people who were in the audience watching the film with me were really responding to it, and you could hear them laughing a lot. They applauded at the end of the film, which you almost never see, just in ordinary screenings here.
Mm.
And so clearly it's working for a lot of people, and it didn't 100% work for me. And it's the kind of film that I would feel comfortable recommending to other people. But I mean, film viewing is ultimately personal in that sense, and I didn't find a lot that I could really connect with in this film. A lot of the scenes you could feel that there was kind of an emotional hook in each scene, but it did feel a little bit calculated because the hook was a little obvious, I guess. But I don't know. But I mean, on the whole, I did enjoy the film. I think for me, what really stood out are the performances. And, it's a great cast. These are actors who I wasn't really familiar with. I'd love to see them in more films. I'm sure they've probably done more films, but
Sure.
yeah, I mean, the acting was really good.
Sure, perhaps they just couldn't overcome the burden of expectation that comes with some of these Oscar nominations. Once again, it's called Belfast, and it's out now in theatres in Korea and available online as well. Next, we have a local gangster flick. It's called Hot Blooded, or Dugonpi in Korean. It's set in 1990s Busan and features the actor Jung Woo in the lead role. It reached the top of the local box office, albeit in a quiet week. Mark, let's start with the director of this film, Cheon Myeong-kwan, because he's an interesting character. He's actually a best-selling novelist, and this is his first time directing. Can you tell us a little bit more about him?
Yeah, it's not often that you see a first feature film from a 58-year-old director, but that's what we have here. He's not totally new to the film scene. He did start off as a screenwriter in the 1990s and had a couple films produced, such as Gun and Gun and The Great Chef. But then he turned to writing novels, basically because he was apparently not getting a lot of his screenplays produced, and so was kind of encouraged to start just writing novels. It was very successful, both critically and commercially, with novels such as Whale and Modern Family, which was turned into a film adaptation, actually, Boomerang Family. And in this one, this film, however, is not one of his novels. Interestingly, it's from another novelist who's a friend of his, Kim Un-soo, and who apparently was inspired to write this novel by the director, who kind of said he had heard kind of stories he was telling about Busan in this era, and said, "Oh, you should turn that into a novel." And so I think that inspired him to want to actually take the plunge into directing with this material.
I see. So I guess he jumped at the chance to make this film. Darcy, can you set up this story for us as well? As you said, it's set in 1990s Busan. Can you tell us more?
Yeah, and actually, the main part of the story takes place in a little city just outside of Busan called Guam. And the lead character, Hisu, is working under an older boss who kind of really rules over this small area. But, he leads a very predictable life. He isn't really making a lot of money or gaining very much power in the current situation that he's in. But the early 1990s were this time when a lot of things were changing in the world of organized crime, partly, because the government had been cracking down on gangs, and that had led to a whole kind of shift in power. And eventually, some larger gangs from Busan start taking an interest in this smaller community. And so that upsets the equilibrium in the city, but it also opens up new opportunities for our lead character. And so the film is basically about how he deals with that, how he tries to take a few of these opportunities and what the consequences of those are.
Okay, so Mark, the gangster genre has a long history in Hollywood and here in Korea as well. What do you think of this film? Does this film do anything to try and stand out?
I think it tries to be more of like a more realistic style of gangster film, but I don't think it quite works, or doesn't quite go far enough in that direction. It's trying to, I think, be both kind of like a more realistic crime kind of thriller, but also be something of an action film. And for me, it didn't quite work as either. Even though I kind of admired some of the performances, and I thought I thought the attempt it was interesting, but I think it ran into some problems too with again trying to ground the film in this realistic 90s Busan setting. I think the filmmakers probably had some trouble recreating that, right? Because Busan has changed so much and the surrounding area has changed so much that they've really had a hard, probably had, and you can kind of tell that in the filmmaking. I was kind of hoping because this was his first film and he was coming from a different medium and writing, that the direction would be a bit more distinctive, or at least different. And it's a very standardly directed film for the most part, and it didn't really. Again, I don't know if it would totally satisfy someone looking for a really violent action movie, and I don't think it would. But I don't think it really is gritty or realistic enough to satisfy that audience either. So it's kind of to me, it was kind of in this in between zone. But it's not. I thought it was a decent effort at least.
Darcy, what about you? This setting, this 90s Busan setting, it is interesting. It's something different.
Yeah, certainly they, they tried to use, CGI and other means to recreate a sense of the 1990s. And, the 1990s are so, in some ways so recent. Particularly for people my age, I remember them quite vividly.
For us old fogies, you mean?
Right. And yet, because Korea has changed so dramatically, so quickly, and it's modernized so quickly, those stories play quite interestingly on the screen in Korea. And and so it did, for me, it did create a distinctive sense of place. I think that when I look back on this film in the future, I may not remember too many details about the story and the plot twist, but the space I'll remember, and the actors as well, like the characters. It's the combination of the space and then the mix of characters created something that felt a little bit different. I won't call it completely new, because this is a genre that has
Sure.
a long history in Korea. We can point to other films that are similar and perhaps better in some ways, but
Sure, but
yeah,
perhaps we
it
can still expect
wasn't
something more
bad.
from the director. There are signs, potentially.
Yeah, I mean, it would be interesting if he continues his directing career at the same time that he, writes his
Sure.
novels. He has obviously been more successful as a novelist, but it would be nice to do both.
Okay, we'll have to wrap it up there. Mark, Darcy, thank you for taking the time to connect with us, and we'll talk to you again next time.
Okay,
Thank you.
have a great weekend.